The handcuffs clicked shut around Marcus Williams's wrists with the finality of a judge's gavel, the cold metal biting into his 17-year-old skin as Officer Derek Lawson tightened them with deliberate force. The cafeteria had fallen silent, 200 pairs of eyes watching as the honor roll student was dragged past, overturned lunch trays and scattered textbooks, his Nike sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum floor. "Maybe this will teach you to respect authority," Lawson hissed, his breath hot against Marcus's ear, as cameras' phones emerged like weapons from every corner of Lincoln High's cafeteria. The officer's grip was unnecessarily tight, his fingers digging into the boy's shoulder as he marched him toward the exit. Past teachers who stood frozen in shock, and students who whispered prayers under their breath. What Officer Lawson didn't know was that in exactly 43 minutes, he would be standing in front of his own apartment building, staring at an eviction notice that would change everything, and the person holding his fate in their hands would be someone he never expected. The truth about what happened next will shake you to your core, because sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the people we judge hold more power than we could ever imagine. This isn't just a story about a traffic stop gone wrong, it's about the moment when the tables turned in a way that nobody saw coming. Officer Derek Lawson adjusted his duty belt as he walked through the main entrance of Abraham Lincoln High School, the familiar weight of his service weapon pressing against his hip like a constant reminder of the authority he carried. The October afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across polished hallways, lined with college preparation banners and academic achievement posters that seemed to mock his own failed educational aspirations. His boots echoed against the terrazzo floors with each deliberate step, a rhythmic percussion that announced his presence to clusters of students who instinctively pressed themselves against lockers, their animated conversations dying mid-sentence as he passed. The air carried the institutional scent of industrial disinfectant mixed with teenage anxiety and the lingering aroma of cafeteria pizza that reminded him of meals he couldn't afford anymore. Officer Lawson, Principal Martinez greeted him with the kind of forced smile that barely concealed underlying tension. "Thank you for responding so quickly. The situation is in the cafeteria." Lawson's jaw tightened as he followed Martinez through corridors decorated with student artwork and motivational quotes about achieving dreams. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was walking through a place designed to inspire futures, while his own crumbled around him like old newspaper. 3 months behind on rent, credit cards maxed out, car payment overdue, the mathematics of his financial ruin played on, repeat in his mind like a broken record. The radio on his shoulder crackled with dispatches from other officers handling real crimes while he dealt with what Martinez had described as a disruptive student incident. The "BIP" phrase grated against his nerves like sandpaper. At 34 years old, Derek Lawson had imagined himself solving major cases, not babysitting teenagers who probably had brighter futures than he'd ever managed to scrape together. "What exactly happened?" Lawson asked, his voice carrying the edge of a man who'd started his day by ignoring calls from bill collectors and ended his morning by discovering another shut-off notice taped to his apartment door. Marcus Williams, one of our honor roll students, became argumentative during lunch. He was using his phone during school hours, and when asked to put it away, he became defiant with the cafeteria supervisor. Lawson's hand moved instinctively to his handcuffs, the metal cool against his fingers. Argumentative how? He raised his voice, used inappropriate language. Some of the other students started recording with their phones, which made the situation worse. Martinez paused outside the cafeteria doors, where the sound of teenage voices created a low hum of anticipation. His teacher says this is completely out of character for him, but we can't let this kind of behavior slide. Through the rectangular window in the door, Lawson could see students seated at long tables, their attention focused on something happening near the serving line. Cell phones were already emerging from pockets despite school policy, their cameras ready to capture whatever drama was about to unfold. The familiar surge of adrenaline mixed with resentment coursed through his veins. This was his reality now. High school cafeteria disputes instead of real police work, suburban teenagers instead of actual criminals. The badge on his chest felt heavier with each passing day, not because of its authority, but because of how little that authority seemed to matter when his landlord came calling or his credit card was declined at the grocery store. "Where is he now?" Lawson asked, pushing through the cafeteria doors with the kind of purposeful stride he'd practiced in front of his bathroom mirror until it looked natural. There, by the windows. Marcus Williams sat alone at a corner table, his backpack beside him and his phone face down on the surface. Even from across the room, Lawson could see the tension in the teenager's shoulders, the way he held himself like someone who knew trouble was coming but hadn't figured out how to escape it. The boy's Harvard University sweatshirt seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, a beacon of academic achievement that made Lawson's community college dropout status sting like an old wound. Students at nearby tables whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Marcus and the approaching officer. The energy in the room shifted perceptibly, conversations becoming hushed and forced, as if everyone sensed they were about to witness something significant. Lawson had played this scene dozens of times before. The approach, the assertion of authority, the demonstration that respect wasn't optional. But today felt different. Today, the financial pressure crushing his chest and the eviction notice burning a hole in his pocket made every interaction feel personal. Every challenge to his authority feel like another reminder of his own powerlessness. "Marcus Williams?" Lawson's voice cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade. The teenager looked up, his dark eyes meeting Lawson's with a mixture of wariness and resignation that seemed older than his 17 years. "Yes, sir." "I need you to stand up and put your hands where I can see them." A ripple of shock moved through the nearby tables. Someone's plastic water bottle hit the floor, the sound sharp against the sudden silence. Marcus remained seated, his expression shifting from wariness to confusion. "Officer, I wasn't doing anything wrong. I said stand up." Lawson's hand moved to his belt, fingers brushing against his handcuffs with practiced intimidation. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The cafeteria had fallen completely silent now. 200 pairs of eyes focused on the scene unfolding by the windows. Cell phone cameras emerged like flowers blooming after rain, their digital lenses capturing every moment from multiple angles. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the harsh, unforgiving glare that made everyone look guilty of something. Marcus slowly rose from his seat, his movements careful and deliberate. His Harvard sweatshirt hung loosely on his frame, and Lawson noticed the acceptance letter peeking from his backpack, front pocket. Another reminder of opportunities, that some people were handed, while others scraped, and fought for scraps. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." "For what? I didn't do anything illegal." Marcus's voice carried the kind of educated articulation that reminded Lawson of lawyers and judges and all the people who'd made him feel stupid during his brief, unsuccessful attempt at higher education. "You were disruptive, disrespectful to school authority, and now you're being non-compliant with a police officer." Lawson stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space in the way he'd been taught to establish dominance. That's disturbing the peace and resisting arrest. The lies came easily now, stacked on top of each other like the unpaid bills on his kitchen table. Lawson had learned that in situations like this, the official report mattered more than the truth, and his version of events would carry more weight than a teenager's protests. Marcus turned slowly, his hands moving behind his back, with the resigned compliance of someone who'd been taught that cooperation was the only path to survival. The handcuffs clicked shut with metallic finality, the sound echoing through the silent cafeteria like a judge's gavel. "Maybe this will teach you to respect authority," Lawson whispered, his breath hot against Marcus's ear as he tightened the cuffs with deliberate pressure. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but he'd learned to swallow worse things lately. Around them, cell phone cameras captured every angle, every word, every moment of a honor roll student being arrested for the crime of existing, while black in a space where someone decided he didn't belong. The students at nearby tables sat frozen, their faces reflecting the familiar horror of watching injustice play out in real time. Lawson gripped Marcus's shoulder and began marching him toward the exit, past overturned lunch trays and scattered textbooks, past teachers who stood paralyzed by the sudden violence of the moment. The boy's Nike sneakers squeaked against the polished floor with each reluctant step, a sound that would echo in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. What Officer Derek Lawson didn't know, as he paraded his 17-year-old prisoner through the cafeteria like a trophy, was that his own reckoning was already in motion. At that very moment, his phone was buzzing with a text message from his landlord, and in exactly 42 minutes, he would be standing in front of his apartment building, staring at an eviction notice that would change the trajectory of his entire life and the person who would hold his fate in their manicured hands was someone whose power he couldn't have imagined, someone whose connection to the boy in handcuffs would turn his world completely upside down. The patrol car's engine idled with mechanical indifference as Marcus Williams sat in the back seat, his wrists burning from handcuffs that had been tightened past necessity. Through the reinforced glass partition, he could see Officer Lawson completing paperwork on his dashboard, the man's pen moving with the same deliberate aggression he'd displayed in the cafeteria. The leather seats stuck to Marcus's skin despite the October chill, and the chemical smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't mask the lingering scent of fear and desperation that seemed embedded in the upholstery from previous passengers. Each breath carried the metallic taste of injustice, sharp and bitter on his tongue like blood from a bitten lip. Outside, students pressed against Lincoln High's windows, their faces blurred through the car's tinted glass, but their shock and outrage visible even from a distance. Some held up their phones, still recording, their silent solidarity the only comfort Marcus could draw from this nightmare. Teachers stood in doorways with expressions of helpless fury, knowing they were witnessing something wrong but powerless to intervene in the machinery of authority once it had been set in motion. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing, drawing on the meditation techniques his mother had taught him during those long nights when she worked double shifts to pay for his SAT prep courses. Dr. Angela Williams had raised him with two fundamental truths. Education was his weapon against a world designed to defeat him, and respect was something you gave until it was proven unworthy of return. He had followed every rule his mother had drilled into him since childhood. Keep your hands visible. Speak respectfully. Never raise your voice. Never run. Never give them a reason to see you as a threat. He had earned a 4.2 GPA, scored in the 99th percentile on his SATs, volunteered at the community center, tutored younger students, and kept his nose so clean it practically sparkled. None of it mattered when Officer Lawson decided to see a threat. Instead of an honor roll student, the Harvard acceptance letter in his backpack felt like cruel irony now, its cream-colored paper and embossed seal representing a future that suddenly seemed as fragile as tissue paper in the rain. 4 years of perfect attendance, countless hours of studying under flickering desk lamps while his mother worked late, summers spent in academic programs instead of hanging out with friends. All of it could be destroyed by whatever charges Lawson decided to manufacture. "You're going to be processed at the station," Lawson said through the partition, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who held absolute power over another person's immediate future. Hope that attitude was worth it. Marcus wanted to respond, to explain that he'd done nothing wrong, that he'd been on the phone with his mother discussing his upcoming Harvard interview, that he'd only raised his voice when the cafeteria supervisor grabbed his arm without explanation. But his mother's warnings echoed in his mind like a mantra. Anything you say can be used against you, and will be. Through the car window, he could see his chemistry teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, standing on the school steps with tears streaming down her face. She'd written one of his college recommendation letters, describing him as a young man of exceptional character and unlimited potential. The disconnect between her words and his current situation felt like a physical weight, pressing against his chest. His phone, the device that had started this entire ordeal, sat somewhere on Lawson's person, confiscated as evidence of his supposed crimes. The last text from his mother was probably still on the screen. "Can't wait to hear about your day, sweetheart. Dad and I are so proud of you." The cruel mathematics of the situation weren't lost on Marcus. His parents had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities they'd never had. His father worked 2 jobs to pay for Marcus's debate team fees and college application costs. His mother had built her real estate empire from nothing, driven by the dream of ensuring her son would never face the limitations she'd overcome through sheer force of will. And now, because Officer Lawson needed to feel powerful, because some arbitrary rule about phone usage had been violated, because a black teenager's voice had been raised in defense of his own dignity, all of that sacrifice might be rendered meaningless. Marcus opened his eyes and stared at the school building, where he'd spent 4 years preparing for a future that now hung in the balance. The American flag above the main entrance moved lazily in the autumn breeze, its promise of liberty and justice feeling like an elaborate joke being played at his expense. Inside his backpack, alongside the Harvard acceptance letter, was a letter from Yale, another from Princeton, and a full scholarship offer from Howard University. Academic achievements that should have been armor against exactly this kind of situation had proven useless against the arbitrary authority of a badge and the presumptions that came with his skin color. What? Marcus didn't know. As he sat in that patrol car watching his classmates' shocked faces through bulletproof glass, was that his mother was already aware of his situation. The call from Principal Martinez had reached her before Lawson had even finished tightening the handcuffs, and Dr. Angela Williams was already moving pieces on a chessboard that existed. Far above Officer Lawson's understanding, she'd built her real estate empire by learning every player in the city's power structure, by understanding that influence was a currency more valuable than money, and by never forgetting the feeling of powerlessness that had driven her to accumulate both. Her son's arrest wasn't just a legal matter, it was a declaration of war against everything she'd worked to build and protect. The irony that would soon unfold was already taking shape in boardrooms and legal offices across the city. While Lawson filled out paperwork that he believed would ruin a teenager's future, the teenager's mother was making phone calls that would reshape the officer's entire world. Marcus shifted in his seat, the handcuffs cutting into his wrists as he tried to find a comfortable position. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional weight of watching 4 years of perfect behavior and academic excellence dissolve under the authority of a man who'd decided his guilt. Before their first interaction, outside, the school day continued around the crater that had been blown in the middle of normalcy. Students walked to their next classes with the shell-shocked expressions of people who'd witnessed something that would change how they saw the world. Teachers huddled in hallways, whispering about lawyers and phone calls, and whether there was anything they could have done differently. But the real story was already unfolding 32 floors above the city, where Dr. Angela Williams sat in her corner office reviewing documents that would make Officer Derek Lawson understand exactly what it felt like to be powerless. The same system that had failed her as a child was now hers to command, and she was about to demonstrate that justice sometimes came from the most unexpected directions. The patrol car pulled away from Lincoln High School, carrying Marcus toward a processing center where his fingerprints would be taken and his name would be entered into databases that colleges and employers would search for years to come. But even as the familiar buildings of his neighborhood blurred past, the wheels of a different kind of justice were already turning. Dr. Angela Williams stood motionless in her corner office on the 32nd floor of the Williams and Associates building, the entire city of Cleveland sprawling beneath her like a three-dimensional chessboard where she'd learned to move pieces with surgical precision. The phone call from Principal Martinez still echoed in her ear through her Bluetooth headset, each word a carefully controlled detonation that threatened to shatter the composure she'd spent 30 years perfecting. Her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a woman who'd transformed childhood poverty into a real estate empire worth $400 million. But right now she felt like the 17-year-old girl who'd once sat in a similar patrol car, handcuffed for the crime of defending herself against a system designed to crush her dreams before they could take root. The stack of legal documents on her mahogany desk told stories of families destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, eviction notices, foreclosure papers, court orders that represented the thin line between shelter and homelessness. These weren't just business transactions to Angela. They were reminders of how quickly power could shift, how vulnerability was often just one missed payment away from anyone's door. Her assistant, Jennifer, hovered near the office entrance with the heightened awareness that came from 3 years of working for a woman who could restructure entire neighborhoods with a phone call. The atmospheric pressure in the room had shifted the moment the school's call came through, and Jennifer recognized the signs of her boss calculating moves on a board that most people couldn't even see. "Mrs. Williams, should I cancel your 4 o'clock with the City Planning Commission?" Jennifer's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to read Angela's moods like weather patterns. Angela turned from the window, her Louboutin heels clicking against Italian marble floors as she moved to her desk. The sound was sharp and decisive, each step a percussion note in a symphony of controlled fury that was building toward a crescendo. Her manicured fingers traced the edge of a manila folder labeled Riverside Garden Apartments, a property she'd purchased 6 months ago as part of her company's affordable housing initiative. "No, cancel everything after 2:30, she said, her voice carrying the calm authority she'd used in boardrooms to move millions of dollars with single sentences. "And get me Detective Morrison from the 5th Precinct. Tell him Dr. Williams needs to speak with him immediately about a civil rights violation involving her son." The irony wasn't lost on her that the same detective, Morrison, who'd arrested her for shoplifting when she was 16, a charge later dismissed when security footage proved her innocence, now answered her calls with the deference reserved for the city's most influential power brokers. Time had a way of rearranging relationships, and Angela had learned to be patient about collecting on old debts. She pulled up the Riverside Garden Apartments file on her computer, scrolling through tenant records until she found the name that made her smile, with the kind of satisfaction that came from watching chess pieces fall into perfect alignment. Officer Derek Lawson, Apartment 2B, 3 months behind on rent, final notice delivered this morning at 9 a.m. The mathematics were beautiful in their simplicity. The man who'd just violated her son's civil rights lived in a building she owned, survived on credit she ultimately controlled, and existed in a web of financial relationships that she could manipulate like a conductor directing an orchestra. Angela opened her desk drawer and removed a photograph taken at Marcus's high school graduation ceremony, his academic honors cords gleaming gold against his black gown, his smile radiant with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. That confidence had probably been shattered in a school cafeteria by a man who needed to feel powerful at the expense of a teenager's dignity. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Mom, I'm okay. Don't worry about me." Even in custody, even facing charges that could derail his future, her son was trying to protect her from worry. The protective instinct worked both ways, and Angela was about to demonstrate that a mother's love backed by generational wealth was a force that could reshape entire lives. She dialed the number for Riverside Garden Apartments, property management company, a subsidiary of her own corporation, though few people connected the dots between Dr. Angela Williams, the real estate mogul, and the various LLCs and holding companies through which she exercised control over half the city's affordable housing market. This is Dr. Williams. I need you to personally deliver the final eviction notice to Derek Lawson in 2B today, and I want to be there when you do it. The property manager's voice carried confusion tinged with concern. Ma'am, we typically handle evictions through standard legal channels. Personal involvement isn't usually. Mr. Patterson, do you remember who signs your paychecks? Angela's tone could have cut glass. I want to be there, in person, this evening. She ended the call and moved back to the window, watching afternoon shadows stretch across the city like dark fingers reaching toward evening. Somewhere below, her son was being processed through a system designed to categorize and dispose of young black men who dared to speak up for themselves. The machinery of injustice was efficient and well-oiled, but it had never encountered the specific combination of maternal fury and unlimited resources that Angela was about to unleash. Her phone rang with Detective Morrison's return call, his voice carrying the mixture of respect and wariness that came from knowing exactly how much influence Angela wielded in city politics. Dr. Williams, I understand you have concerns about an incident involving your son. Detective Morrison, I need you to review the arrest record for Marcus Williams. 17 years old, honor roll student, arrested at Lincoln High School approximately 1 hour ago by Officer Derek Lawson. I want to know if proper protocols were followed, if the charges are justified, and if my son's civil rights were violated. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Angela to count her heartbeats. Morrison had been a detective long enough to recognize the difference between a concerned parent and a declaration of war, and Angela's tone left no doubt about which category this conversation fell into. I'll look into it immediately. Dr. Williams, can you give me until end of business today? You have until 5 p.m., and Detective Morrison, I trust you'll be thorough. She ended the call and sat behind her desk, opening another file that contained property records, financial statements, and corporate structures that represented the real power in Cleveland's municipal government. The city council members who voted on zoning changes, the bank executives who approved municipal loans, the construction companies that built public housing projects. Angela's web of influence touched all of them, directly or indirectly. Officer Derek Lawson had made the mistake of believing that his badge represented the ultimate authority in any interaction. He was about to learn that authority was relative, and that the teenager he'd just humiliated was connected to power structures he couldn't have imagined. Angela's phone buzzed with an incoming call from the most expensive criminal defense attorney in Ohio, a man whose retainer fee exceeded most people's annual salaries. Tom, I need you to represent my son. He was arrested this afternoon on what I believe are completely fabricated charges. Consider it done, Angela. I'll be at the station within the hour. The chess pieces were moving now, each phone call and legal maneuver part of a larger strategy that would demonstrate the difference between the authority of a badge and the power of generational wealth channeled through maternal love. Angela had built her empire by learning that the most effective victories were those where your opponent didn't realize they were fighting until the game was already over. She glanced at her watch. 3:47 p.m. In exactly 13 minutes, Officer Derek Lawson would be arriving at his apartment building to discover that his eviction notice had been personally delivered. And in approximately 2 hours, he would learn that his landlord was the mother of the boy he'd just arrested. The irony was so perfect it felt like divine intervention, but Angela knew better than to rely on chance. She'd spent years positioning herself to have options when life demanded justice, And today was the day those preparations would pay dividends that Derek Lawson couldn't have calculated in his worst nightmares. The dashboard clock in Officer Derek Lawson's patrol car read 3:47 p.m. As he navigated through Cleveland's residential neighborhoods, watching the landscape shift from hope to despair with each passing block. Tree-lined streets with well-maintained sidewalks gradually gave way to cracked pavement and boarded windows, a visual reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how thin the line was between stability and collapse. His radio had fallen silent after the Lincoln High incident, but his mind raced with justifications for what had happened in the cafeteria. The paperwork was already filed, the charges officially recorded. The teenager processed through a system that would follow him for years to come. In Lawson's experience, these situations always blew over eventually. Parents complained, lawyers made noise, but badges carried weight that most people couldn't challenge. The autumn sun slanted through his windshield at an angle that highlighted every stress line around his eyes, every coffee stain on his uniform, every visible sign of a life that was slowly unraveling despite his best efforts to hold it together. His reflection in the rearview mirror showed a man who'd once believed that wearing a badge would solve his problems, only to discover that authority over others couldn't fix the fundamental mathematics of his own existence. His phone buzzed against his leg with an incoming text message, the sound sharp against the relative quiet of his patrol car. Without looking, he knew it was another reminder from his landlord. Another notice about overdue payments. Another countdown toward the homelessness that lurked at the edges of his consciousness like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. 3 months behind on rent. Credit cards maxed out at $17,000. Car payment 60 days overdue. Insurance canceled for non-payment. The numbers played in his head like a broken calculator, adding and subtracting and never reaching a sum that made sense or offered any hope of resolution. Lawson pulled over at a red light and finally checked his phone, the screen illuminating his face with the cold glow of digital inevitability. Final notice. Payment due by 5 p.m. today, or eviction proceedings begin immediately. Management will be conducting final inspection this afternoon. Patterson Property Management. The words hit his stomach like ice water. 5 p.m., less than 2 hours away. Eviction proceedings meant lawyers and court dates and public records that would follow him forever, making it impossible to rent anywhere else, even if he could scrape together first and last month's rent plus security deposit. He'd been gambling that his next paycheck would buy him another month, maybe 2 if he could negotiate a payment plan. Police officers weren't supposed to be homeless. The uniform was supposed to mean something, represent stability and authority, and the kind of steady middle-class existence that came with serving the community. The light turned green, but Lawson sat frozen in his car as other vehicles moved around him, their drivers honking with the impatience of people who had places to go and lives that made sense. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles went white, the leather creaking under the pressure of a man trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. The arrest of Marcus Williams suddenly felt like more than just another teenage discipline problem. It felt like the universe's way of giving him one moment of control in a life that had spiraled completely beyond his ability to manage. For 43 minutes in that school cafeteria, he'd been the one with power, the one making decisions that mattered, the one whose authority couldn't be questioned or negotiated or bargained with. Now, driving through neighborhoods where every other house displayed the kind of economic devastation he was about to join, Lawson felt the temporary high of authority drain away like water through a broken dam. The badge on his chest felt heavier with each block, not because of its importance, but because of how little it would matter when his landlord came calling. He turned onto Riverside Drive, the street where his apartment complex squatted among overgrown trees and cracked sidewalks like a monument to broken dreams. The Riverside Garden Apartments had been built in the 1970s with optimistic names and modest hopes, but 4 decades of deferred maintenance had turned them into the kind of place where people landed when better options weren't available. His unit in Building 2 faced the parking lot, which meant his windows looked out on a landscape of rusted cars and overflowing dumpsters instead of the river that gave the complex its name. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days moving through the city with authority, while returning each night to the kind of place where hope went to die. As he pulled into his assigned parking space, Lawson noticed a black Mercedes sedan parked across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun like dark mirrors. The car was clean and expensive, completely out of place in a neighborhood where most vehicles were held together with duct tape and prayer. Something about it made his cop instincts twitch with unease, but his personal problems were too immediate to worry about surveillance or whatever business brought luxury cars to his rundown corner of the city. The manila envelope containing his eviction notice was waiting on his doorstep like a yellow flag of surrender, its official seals and legal language representing the end of his tenancy and the beginning of homelessness. Lawson picked it up with trembling hands, the paper feeling heavier than it should have, weighted with the gravity of consequences he could no longer avoid or postpone. Inside his apartment, the furniture he'd bought on credit and the television he was still making payments on seemed to mock him with their temporary nature. Everything he'd accumulated could be repossessed, evicted, or abandoned, leaving him with nothing but the uniform that had once represented security and stability. Silence in his apartment was broken only by the hum of a refrigerator that contained mostly condiments and expired milk, and the distant sound of traffic carrying other people toward lives that hadn't collapsed under the weight of poor decisions and worse luck. Lawson sat on his second-hand couch and stared at the eviction notice, reading legal phrases that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the hope they offered. What Officer Derek Lawson didn't know, as he sat in his government-subsidized apartment reading about his own impending homelessness, was that the black Mercedes across the street belonged to Dr. Angela Williams, and that she was currently reviewing property records that showed her ownership of the very building where he lived. The same teenager he'd arrested 43 minutes ago was the son of his landlord, and the wheels of a justice he couldn't have imagined were already turning with mathematical precision. The knock on his door, when it came 20 minutes later, would change everything he thought he understood about power, authority, and the kind of consequences that could follow a man who confused his badge with actual strength. Sometimes the universe arranged its own lessons, and sometimes those lessons came dressed in designer suits with the power to rewrite someone's entire story. The knock on Derek Lawson's apartment door came at exactly 4:23 p.m., sharp and authoritative in the way that immediately announced official business. He'd been staring at the eviction notice for 20 minutes, the legal language blurring together like hieroglyphics that spelled out his own destruction, when the sound cut through his apartment's oppressive silence like a blade. Through his peephole, he could see Patterson, the property manager, shifting nervously in the hallway with a manila folder clutched against his chest. Behind Patterson stood a woman in an expensive charcoal suit, her presence radiating the kind of quiet authority that made even property managers nervous. Lawson couldn't see her face clearly through the distorted lens, but something about her posture suggested she was the kind of person who was used to having her words carry weight. Lawson opened the door with the resigned acceptance of a man who'd run out of ways to postpone his own reckoning. Patterson looked uncomfortable, his usually confident demeanor replaced by the fidgety anxiety of someone delivering news they'd rather avoid. The woman beside him stood perfectly still, her dark eyes scanning Lawson's face with the clinical attention of someone conducting an evaluation. "Officer Lawson," Patterson began, his voice carrying the forced professionalism of a man reading from a script he'd rather not be performing. "This is Dr. Williams, the owner of the property." She wanted to speak with you personally about your lease situation. The name hit Lawson like a physical blow, recognition dawning with the slow horror of watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. Williams. The same last name as the teenager he'd arrested less than 2 hours ago. The same last name that had been written on the Harvard acceptance letter he'd glimpsed in the boy's backpack. Dr. Angela Williams stepped forward, and Lawson found himself face to face with a woman whose presence seemed to fill the narrow hallway despite her average height. Her suit was tailored perfectly, her jewelry understated but clearly expensive, her shoes the kind that cost more than his monthly rent payment. Everything about her spoke of wealth and power, but her eyes carried something harder. The focused intensity of someone who'd fought for everything she'd achieved and wasn't planning to lose any of it. "Officer Lawson," she said, her voice carrying the same educated articulation he'd heard in her son's protest just hours ago. "I believe we have some things to discuss." The autumn wind whipped through the apartment complex's courtyards, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the faint smell of someone's dinner cooking in a neighboring unit. The sound of children playing in the distance mixed with the hum of traffic from Riverside Drive, creating a backdrop of normal life continuing while Lawson's world rearranged itself around this impossible coincidence. "Dr. Williams," he managed, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. "I wasn't expecting. Patterson usually handles—" "May we come in?" Angela interrupted, the question phrased politely, but carrying the unmistakable weight of a command. "I think you'll find our conversation more productive in private." Lawson stepped aside, watching as Angela Williams entered his apartment with the careful attention of someone appraising property she owned. Her eyes took in the second-hand furniture, the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen counter, the general air of barely controlled desperation that hung over his living space like fog. Patterson followed behind her, closing the door with the soft click of finality. The contrast between Angela's polished presence and his apartment's shabby reality was stark enough to make Lawson acutely aware of how far he'd fallen. The woman standing in his living room represented everything he'd never achieved. Success? Stability? The kind of generational wealth that could survive any economic storm. "I understand you're behind on your rent," Angela said, settling into his threadbare armchair as if it were a throne. 3 months, according to Patterson's records. Lawson remained standing, his cop instincts telling him that sitting would put him at a psychological disadvantage he couldn't afford. "I've been having some financial difficulties, but I'm working on getting caught up. My next paycheck." "Your next paycheck won't cover 3 months of back rent plus late fees plus court costs," Angela interrupted, her tone matter-of-fact rather than cruel. "The mathematics don't work in your favor, Officer Lawson." Patterson cleared his throat nervously, consulting his folder like a lifeline. "The total amount owed, including penalties and legal fees, comes to $4,732. Due in full by 5 p.m. today, or we proceed with eviction." The number hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Lawson's checking account contained exactly $93.18, his credit cards were maxed out, and his family relationships had been strained past the breaking point by previous requests for money. $4,000 might as well have been $4 million. "Dr. Williams," he began, hating the pleading tone that had crept into his voice. "If I could just have a little more time—" "Time?" Angela's eyebrows rose slightly, and for the first time, her composed expression showed a hint of something sharper. "That's interesting. This afternoon, my son asked for time to explain why he was on his phone during lunch. He asked for time to finish his conversation with me about his college interview. He asked for time to be treated with the same respect you'd show any other honor roll student." The words hit Lawson like punches, each one landing with the precision of someone who'd had hours to plan this conversation. Angela's voice remained calm, but underneath the professional tone was something that made him understand exactly who he was dealing with. "You didn't give him time, did you, Officer Lawson?" You didn't give him the benefit of the doubt. You didn't treat him like a young man who'd earned respect through 4 years of academic excellence and community service. You saw what you wanted to see, and you acted on assumptions that had nothing to do with his actual behavior. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in the corner, clearly wishing he were anywhere else but trapped in a conversation that had moved far beyond simple property management. The manila folder in his hands contained legal documents that would make Lawson homeless, but the real judgment was happening in the space between Angela's words and his growing understanding of what he'd done. "Ma'am, if this is about your son's arrest, that's a separate matter. Police procedures and rental agreements are they?" Angela stood up, her movement fluid and controlled, like a judge rising to deliver a verdict. "Because from where I sit, Officer Lawson, everything is connected. The same attitude that made you believe you could humiliate a teenager for no reason is the same attitude that makes you think you can live in my property without paying rent." The truth of it hit him like cold water. For months, he'd been making excuses, finding reasons why his situation was temporary, why normal rules didn't quite apply to his circumstances. He'd been living in a fantasy where his badge provided protection from consequences, where authority in one area of his life could somehow compensate for failure in another. "The mathematics are quite simple," Angela continued, her voice taking on the tone she probably used in boardrooms when explaining complex financial arrangements. "You owe me money you don't have, for an apartment you can't afford, while drawing a salary from a job where you apparently believe you can abuse teenagers without consequences." The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows of Lawson's apartment like bones shaking in a cup. Through the glass, he could see other residents going about their evening routines, unaware that in Unit 2B, a reckoning was unfolding that would change at least one life forever. Angela reached into her purse and withdrew a leather portfolio, her movements deliberate and practiced. "I've reviewed your financial records, Officer Lawson. I know about your credit card debt, your car payment, your insurance situation. I know that you're approximately 6 weeks away from complete financial collapse." The invasion of privacy should have angered him, but instead, Lawson felt only the hollow recognition of someone whose secrets had been laid bare by someone with the resources to uncover them. In less than 4 hours, he'd gone from believing himself to be an authority figure to understanding that he was nothing more than a tenant who couldn't pay his bills, facing a landlord who had every legal right to destroy his life. "But I'm a reasonable woman," Angela said, opening her portfolio to reveal documents that Lawson couldn't read from his position across the room. "And I believe in second chances, under the right circumstances." For the first time since she'd entered his apartment, Lawson felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was negotiable. Maybe there was a way out that didn't involve sleeping in his patrol car or moving back in with his mother in Toledo. "What kind of circumstances?" he asked, hating how desperate he sounded but unable to pretend otherwise. Angela smiled, and the expression was sharp enough to cut glass. The smile on Dr. Angela Williams's face carried the kind of cold satisfaction that came from watching chess pieces fall into positions she'd been planning for hours. Officer Derek Lawson stood in the center of his own living room like a defendant awaiting judgment. His earlier confidence completely evaporated under the weight of understanding exactly who held his immediate future in her manicured hands. Patterson had retreated to a corner near the door, clutching his manila folder like a shield against the tension that filled the apartment's stale air. Through the windows, the October sun was setting behind Cleveland's skyline, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward Lawson with dark fingers of approaching consequence. "The circumstances are quite straightforward, Officer Lawson," Angela said, settling back into his threadbare armchair with the composed authority of someone conducting a business meeting in her own boardroom. "My son is currently sitting in a holding cell because you decided to arrest an honor roll student for the crime of existing while black in your presence." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. Lawson felt his face flush, with a combination of shame and defensive anger. But any protest died in his throat when he met Angela's steady gaze. She wasn't emotional or hysterical like the parents he was used to dealing with. She was calculating, methodical, and clearly several moves ahead in a game he was just beginning to understand. Dr. Williams, the arrest was by the book. Your son was being disruptive, and when I asked him to comply, stop! Angela's voice cut through his explanation like a blade through paper. I've already spoken with Detective Morrison. I've reviewed the security footage from the school. I've talked to witnesses. What you call by the book looks remarkably like a power trip taken at the expense of a teenager who'd never been in trouble. A day in his life. She opened her leather portfolio and withdrew a series of photographs printed on high-quality paper. Even from his position across the room, Lawson could see they were screenshots from cell phone videos. Images of him tightening handcuffs, marching Marcus through the cafeteria, the look of cruel satisfaction on his face as he paraded his 17-year-old prisoner past shocked classmates. 47 different students recorded your performance this afternoon, Angela continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the devastating nature of her words. The videos have already been uploaded to social media. The local news stations have been calling my office for comment. By tomorrow morning, your face will be associated with the phrase police brutality in every newspaper in Ohio. The revelation hit Lawson like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on asserting his authority in the moment that he'd completely ignored the forest of cell phone cameras documenting his every move. In the digital age, there was no such thing as an incident without witnesses, and he'd performed his abuse of power in front of an audience of teenagers who knew how to make videos go viral. But, Angela said, and the single word carried enough weight to make Lawson lean forward despite himself. I'm not interested in destroying your career. I'm interested in justice, and sometimes justice looks different than revenge. She reached into her portfolio again and withdrew a different set of documents, official-looking, papers with legal seals and signature lines that suggested contracts rather than court filings. Patterson shifted nervously in his corner, clearly uncomfortable with whatever arrangement his boss had devised. Here's what's going to happen, Officer Lawson. You're going to drop all charges against my son. You're going to write a formal apology acknowledging that the arrest was unjustified and based on your own bias rather than any actual wrongdoing on his part. You're going to submit to additional training on civil rights and de-escalation techniques, at your own expense. Each demand felt like another weight being added to Lawson's shoulders, but he could see the logic in Angela's approach. Public contrition was humiliating but survivable. Criminal charges and civil lawsuits were not. And in exchange, he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. In exchange, I'll forgive your back rent. I'll give you a 6-month lease extension at a reduced rate that actually aligns with what you can afford on a police officer's salary. I'll make sure the videos from today disappear from social media before they gain enough traction to end your career. The offer was more generous than he'd dared to hope, but Angela's expression suggested there was more to the arrangement than simple mercy. However, she continued, and her voice took on the steel that had probably intimidated countless business adversaries over the years, if you ever, and I mean ever, abuse your authority again, if I hear about you treating any citizen the way you treated my son today, if you give me any reason to believe that you haven't learned from this experience, then I will destroy you so completely that you'll wish you'd never pinned on that badge. The threat was delivered with the same calm professionalism she'd used to discuss rent payments, but Lawson had no doubt about her ability to follow through. The woman sitting in his cheap furniture owned his home, had connections throughout the city's power structure, and possessed the kind of generational wealth that could make problems disappear, or create problems that would follow him for the rest of his life. I understand, he said, and for the first time in hours, the words felt true rather than defensive. Angela stood up, smoothing her suit jacket with movements that suggested their business was concluded. Patterson immediately moved toward the door, clearly eager to escape the tension that had made the apartment feel smaller than its already modest dimensions. "There's one more thing," Angela said, pausing near the door with her hand on the knob. "My son has a college interview next week. Harvard. He's worked 4 years for that opportunity, maintained a perfect GPA, volunteered in the community, and earned the respect of every teacher he's had." She turned back to face Lawson, and for the first time, her composed mask slipped enough to show the fierce maternal love that had driven her from poverty to power. "Today, because of your actions, he's sitting in a holding cell, wondering if his dreams are over before they've had a chance to begin. Tomorrow, he'll be wondering if every police officer he encounters will see a threat instead of a young man who's earned every opportunity he's received." The weight of that realization settled over Lawson like a heavy blanket. He'd never thought about the lasting impact of his actions on the people he arrested. They were just paperwork to be processed, problems to be solved, statistics to be recorded. But Marcus Williams wasn't a statistic. He was someone's son, someone's hope, someone's investment in a future that Lawson had nearly destroyed with his need to feel powerful. "I want you to remember this feeling, Officer Lawson. I want you to remember what it's like to be powerless, to have your future in someone else's hands, to understand that authority is something you earn rather than something you take. The next time you put on that uniform, I want you to remember that the badge doesn't make you better than anyone else. It makes you responsible for being better than you were today." Angela opened the door, letting in the cool evening air and the sounds of normal life continuing in the world outside. Patterson hurried past her into the hallway, clearly relieved to escape the confined space where justice had been negotiated like a business transaction. "The paperwork will be on Detective Morrison's desk in the morning," Angela said, her voice returning to its professional tone. "I'll expect your written apology by noon. And, Officer Lawson, my son's name is Marcus. Not suspect, not perpetrator, not that kid. His name is Marcus Williams, and he deserves to be remembered as more than just another case number." The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded final, like the end of a chapter in a book that Lawson hadn't realized he was writing. Through his window, he watched Angela walk to the black Mercedes, her posture straight and confident, despite the weight of the justice she'd just administered. As the car pulled away, Lawson sank into his armchair, the same chair where Angela had sat, while reconstructing his understanding of power and consequence. The eviction notice lay forgotten on his coffee table, no longer the most pressing threat to his future. Instead, he found himself thinking about a 17-year-old boy with Harvard acceptance letters and handcuff marks on his wrists, wondering what kind of officer he wanted to be when he put on his uniform tomorrow morning. The mathematics had changed completely in the span of 2 hours. Power, he realized, wasn't about the authority to arrest or evict or humiliate. Real power was about having choices when other people had none, about using influence to build rather than destroy, about understanding that every action created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Outside, Cleveland settled into evening routines while Derek Lawson sat in his apartment, learning lessons that should have been obvious years ago. Sometimes justice came from unexpected directions. Sometimes consequences arrived dressed in designer suits. And sometimes the people you stepped on were connected to forces you never saw coming. But most importantly, sometimes those forces were willing to teach rather than destroy, to offer redemption rather than revenge, to demonstrate that true authority came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The badge would feel different tomorrow, heavier with responsibility, but lighter with the understanding that respect was earned through service rather than demanded through fear. And somewhere across the city, Marcus Williams would go home to parents who'd moved heaven and earth to protect his future, carrying stories that would remind him for the rest of his life that power comes in many forms, and the most dangerous kind is often the most invisible.